Welcome to my stream. My name is EC, and I like to have respectful conversations about nuanced topics. I like to have conversations about a little bit of everything. It can be anything from, as we're discussing today, the history of hair, or we can get into more scientific conversations, more pop culture conversations. I like to weave the threads of influencing facts and contextual clues together to understand a subject a little bit more deeply. In honor of International Women's Day, I decided that today we're going to be doing a stream discussing the language and history of hair and hairstyles, hair like accessorizing, braiding techniques, as well as debunking some myths about hair and the history of hair. So because today is International Women's Day, I wanted to have a conversation about hair, but hair is not gender specific. It has a very strong significance across genders, across cultures, across socioeconomic statuses, and it's used in media to portray very specific messages about a person's class, sense of self, propriety, and even health, as well as their socioeconomic status or access to, I guess you could say, the more positive of experiences to the most negative of experience. Also, it is used consistently to help demonstrate for the viewer if somebody is to be trusted or not, which is quite interesting to me. So there's a lot of messaging that is surrounds hair in media, but also in our day-to-day environments. There have been some really important landmark decisions about hair that have had far-reaching legal consequences throughout the ages. There's also some very frustrating assumptions about hair and access to particular styles that has a lot of frustrating connotations that have been still somehow controversial to even discuss based on the hairstyle and who is wearing it. I also feel like hair is one of those global signifiers that, regardless of one's station or sense of place within society, hair is one of those communicating tools that can communicate across language divides as well. And it's definitely been used in some very interesting ways, to sometimes even contradictory ways, to communicate non-verbally to others about either to project personal assumptions or to reinforce harmful narratives and stereotypes. Now, what's funny is what's actually started me off on this topic of conversation was I had this really silly thought where I was like, wait a minute. When did people start having bangs? When were bangs a thing? And it didn't occur to me until more recently that it was totally possible to have bangs at any point in our history. So long as we have had sharp implements in which to cut our own hair, we have been able to have a whole realm of hairstyles. So it was pretty funny to challenge my own assumptions in that way and to even realize I had them. Another thing, there's been a lot of conversation this past year about the film Frankenstein, and it's been compared a little bit to Wuthering Heights. And I'm still in my Wuthering Heights kick, where there's a lot of frustration with Wuthering Heights of how to do period accuracy wrong, where there's a lot of symbolism that's getting missed out on because of everything from the characters and the actors portraying them, their hair color, to the types of clothes that they're wearing. On the other hand, you have Frankenstein, which did take certain liberties, but their hairstyles and their clothing and costuming were seen as some of the best examples of period accurate clothing in cinema in our more modern days. And I thought that was quite an interesting discussion because I feel like hair is one of those topics where it might not be the first thing you think about as a major source of political resistance or of political policing around oneself. Especially for people who have grown up where they perhaps fit conventional norms, which codes to mean actually white European standards of beauty. And hair has always been associated very heavily with beauty and the beauty industry. Being able to take care of one's hair is a luxury. It's also one of those situations where many people regard even having conversations around hair as frivolous unless it personally affects them. And hair is actually significantly more important to our day-to-day than we often recognize. The way that we interact with one another based on our assumptions about a different person's hairstyle or our own hairstyles can really, really, really communicate in a quiet way to others any biases we might have that we're not fully aware of. What I kind of want to start with the ancient Egyptians, where they actually were some of the earliest recorded of a very strict regulation across socioeconomic divide and class as to who was allowed to wear their hair in certain ways. If you were more wealthy, it was more likely that you were going to have access to wigs, and you were more likely to keep your head shaved for the heat because Egypt is in northern Africa and it is quite hot. If you were of a certain status within society, you could have certain hairstyles that were very, very closely regulated. So for example, if you were a wealthier class, you were more likely to have your hair almost completely cut, like shaved, except for one half right on one particular side of your head. And it was a consistent hairstyle for children of a particular status in wealth. So if you were moving through the world and say you were outside of your normal, neighborhoods, other people could mark you within seconds of your class and status based on your haircut and your hairstyle. On the other hand, you were an enslaved person, you were more likely to have your head completely shaved with no access to wigs or other accessories that would have allowed you to maybe hide that fact or present yourself as a different socioeconomic status than you were. Now, another thing that I think is interesting is the history of wigs. That could be a full conversation and definitely a full video. We're going to talk a little bit about wigs throughout today's stream, but we're not going to go too deep into the history of wigs. But the ancient Egyptians were some of the very first people to have and to consistently wear wigs with ceremonial components involved in how their wigs were stylized. It's generally more blunt bangs and about shoulder length hair. It was not as common exceptionally long hair or exceptionally long wigs, partially because of the heat and also for maintenance. Hair that was used for those wigs sometimes did come from enslaved people, but sometimes also came from animals or other sources, depending on what the wig was made out of and some of the styles that the wig was going to be put in. It was not uncommon to have pieces of jewelry or highly valued materials sewn into your wigs or to add details to your hairstyles. And it was another way to show one's class and status that you were wealthy enough to be able to have jewelry in your hair. It's pretty funny because I feel like that is still the case today. There are some things about how humans structure ourselves that have never changed. This is definitely one of them. Now, another thing that I think is interesting is when you look at the, kind of fast forward a little bit in history, if you look at the Greeks, they also had a fascination with wigs. They had a very different hairstyle, being in a different part of the world, geography and climate has a lot to do with what kinds of hairstyles are popular and which ones are status symbols versus which ones aren't. And there was a habit among wealthier Greek people to make wigs out of the hair of enslaved people from Gaul, who were a group of Celtic people who had been living in what is now France, who had been enslaved in Greece. And they often had golden hair coming from a space that was significantly more Nordic than the Greeks. And so their hair was seen as a prized possession. So it was very common for wealthier, especially the more wealthy of society, would have wigs made out of golden hair from their enslaved peoples. It was fascinating when you think about the fact that there was very little precedent to see people who had golden hair in that part of the world at that time, because it just wasn't as genetically common. Not that it was never happened, but it was not as genetically common. And so universally, it seems as if golden hair is prized as a symbol of wealth, purity, and positive association. Now, one thing that I think is really interesting is as we look through history and look at how hair has been used as a status symbol, certain things maintain themselves throughout time. One is that the lighter one's hair is, the more highly prized it is. The also association with godliness, purity, and innocence is significantly higher when discussing golden or blonde hair versus if you're looking at darker hair. There are absolute misunderstandings that are associated between certain hair colors and personalities, or assumptions of illness or negative personality traits. And the biggest example of that is actually red hair. So there is a very consistent belief in especially Western European spaces that if you had red hair, there was something that was negative about you. There was a lot of assumption that even having red hair was somehow associating you with witchcraft or with the devil or with a pagan or fairies or non-religiously approved components. So there was definitely a negative stereotype, especially when it related to a person who was redheaded and their ability to handle pain or respond in situations. And so there were certain stereotypes that started to be propagated, did kind of make their rounds all the way around the world, which was this idea that if you were a redhead, you're fiery. And many, many, many years later, centuries later, there were studies that were actually done on people who have red hair, and it was discovered that if you have the gene for red hair, you are more likely to be less tolerant for pain and more reactive to pain. So it's fascinating how there are certain negative stereotypes and assumptions that led to widespread beliefs about certain groups of people that were radically inaccurate, but ultimately did have a very unexpected scientific component that I guess you could say was involved long before anybody had any understanding of the deeper scientific aspects related to genetics and related to inherited genetic traits. And so because there was this assumption of difference, that before people could understand that there are certain things that are more common if you carry certain genes, there were stereotypes that were assumed based on their hair color. But at the same time, there was this fascination with red hair, and you see it a lot more in more modern media, especially because unfortunately the gene for red hair is significantly less common and naturally occurring now than it was, say, any time between the Middle Ages to today. There definitely has become almost like a fetishization around red hair and a fetishization around the stereotype of what a person would be like if they have red hair. So it's again another one of those situations where there is a stereotype that's developed and reinforced by cultural norms of multiple different eras that get reinforced again and again and again as time goes on, and then becomes mythologized because of a lack of access to a group of people. Also, interestingly, curly hair was very highly prized throughout the ages. Like soft ringlets were very, very highly prized, whereas getting one's hair to curl the right way in a controlled way was seen as a status symbol. One thing that would happen a lot is a lot of Greek women would wear their hair partially up and partially down with a pretty intricate braid that would encircle the crown of their head, have soft pieces of cloth that had certain colors to them. Generally, they would wear white hair wraps that would help protect their hair from dirt and dust and the sun, while also allowing them to maintaining the health of their hair and the hygienic nature of themselves. But if they got an option and they were wealthy enough, they would tightly braid or pull back their hair and put on a wig made of human hair. And they would also then include other components of and signs of wealth within those wigs. So you might have jewels around the crown. They could be even wrapped into sections throughout the wig. It's very interesting, all the different ways that people create signs of wealth and beauty through access to things that are shiny. And I wonder if the fact that golden hair and blonde hair does have such a strong like shine in the sun does something, or has some sort of strong instinct for us as humans to find it positive or pretty or attractive. Are humans magpies? We might be magpies. One thing that was very common and is going to serve as a consistent pattern as we look through all these different cases throughout history of hair is there are certain archetypes associated with different hairstyles. So almost universally, when children have their hairs styled, it's often not styled in extraordinary ways or in elaborate structures. You don't often have incredible braid styles or have your hair pulled back severely. Most of the time, children of all genders will have longer, free-flowing hair, and it becomes a sign of adulthood to have one's hair styled. So a lot of hairstyles developed out of two things: necessity and signaling. So on one hand, it was important to be able to maintain the health and the hygiene of oneself by utilizing hairstyles that could keep your hair from getting dirty, while also being able to signal that those styles indicated certain things about one's wealth or space in society. And so what you often see is children will have long, free-flowing hair. And then right around the time that especially girls are marrying age, you're going to see that they have very more common to have longer hair that is left open. And even on a person's wedding day, their hair is often left unstyled and flowing down their back. And then once they are married, it becomes a signal of them ascending to adulthood when they have to start pulling their hair back. They may start braiding it. They may start piling it on their heads in very specific styles based on culture and region. And they may also start covering their hair. And there's different hairstyles based on what age you might be. And so certain intricate hairstyles are reserved for people who are in higher positions of power and who may also be trying to showcase themselves as more mature and more powerful and more intelligent. And there is a very strong association of innocence with free-flowing, longer hair, as well as youth. So sometimes when people want to portray a sense of youthfulness, they will have longer hair that is free-flowing. But if they want to portray a sense of strength, power, or authority, they will pull their hair back, or they will have a very ornate or structured style of headdress to help communicate that nonverbally to others. And there's many opportunities when you go from there to add in more signifiers of wealth or class, or attempted signifiers of wealth or class, depending on one's access to financial resources and power. With this structured style of to start tying your hair back, covering it, or braiding it, or all of the above, there were even further distinctions to how you could do that could sometimes get the really serious ire from religious groups. There was a case of a group of noble women in the Renaissance era who had a very specific style that was called the mushroom, where they would take a big braid of hair and they would wear it as like almost like a crown around the top of their hair that would give the appearance of a mushroom. And they would either tie things in it, or they would have jewels, and they would also have fringes like what I'm wearing right now. Like they'd have little fringes or bangs of hair to hide their foreheads. And that was too much. That was too much for the religious leaders at the time. They were condemned for being unpure and being frivolous with their style because you couldn't see their foreheads. And so they were admonished to adjust their style, to pull their braids back, and pull their bangs back and wear their hair differently, because being unable to see one's forehead was actually a sign of a lack of morality. And that admonishment actually ended up being very influential, and had been influential in earlier iterations throughout, especially Europe, where in the early medieval eras, women actually were not supposed to have their hair seen at all by anybody but their husbands. So they would wear these quite ornate hats. That's where you kind of see that princess hat with the cone, and they would actually shave their hairlines back, because the longer, more prominent one's forehead was, it was believed to be more beautiful. They would also pluck their eyebrows or shave them off completely. It was not seen as positive for anybody who was not one's husband to see one's hair, even one's eyebrows. Another component that I want to talk about was the concept of, if you are less wealthy, the likelihood was that most of the time your hair, outside of who was going to be immediately seeing you in an intimate setting, was going to be hidden behind more severe cloths, more like scarves, caps, not as ornate as a very like high class or wealthy individual, but you could have like multiple layers of hair coverings to avoid the association of attractiveness with oneself if you were in a servant role. So if you were a woman in any time period, it was not uncommon for one to either have the presence as if you did not have hair at all. If they worked in a service position, especially in a proximity to wealth, it was even more important that one hid their hair. And due to a long-standing association of hair with intimacy, there has been, and this is very highly influenced by purity culture, which is often derived from Christian mentalities, which were super, super impactful, at least throughout Europe, and then, of course, throughout the Americas, once colonization took place, but also throughout the West Asian world as well. There was a strong association that you needed to have one's hair covered if you were outside of your own home space. hijab are still very, very common, and a way to communicate both one's association with a particular religious belief and the cultural standards that are set by those belief systems. And so hair is another quiet indicator of one's place in society that also indicates one's worth. If you are somebody who has the access to wealth and class, and somebody sees your hair and it is out of its either protective braiding style or covering, and you see one's hair after someone is married and they have, say, their hair long and free flowing, it's seen as an extraordinarily intimate thing. But it's also a little bit coveted if you're talking about somebody who's, say, a queen. But if you're talking about a person who's a servant, then you're more likely to see a sense of degradation associated with that if somebody who is in an assumption about that person, of there being loose morals or something negative about them, if somebody is able to see that person's hair almost as if they weren't wearing clothes. Throughout the ages, women and people of all genders are extraordinarily resourceful when it comes to styling hair and also kind of trouncing social rigidity about who is allowed to wear which hairstyle. What's fascinating too is that there was actually, throughout, there's multiple different African countries that have utilized braiding and stylizing practices as a communication method, which was adopted throughout the United States when Black Americans were forced to find ways to escape enslavement. And cornrows were a very helpful method of the whole entire language came about from being able to use hair as a communication technique. Also with experimenting chemically to attain certain idealized looks. Even all the way back in the Middle Ages, people were dyeing their hair, but they dyed it with materials that were probably not less bad, but conceptually pretty gross. But actually, all the way back to the ancient Egyptians used henna to dye their hair and would often darken it instead of lighten it. But pretty quickly, at least in Western spaces, people tried to start lightening their hair quite early. What they would do is sometimes they would use white wine and lemon juice, and they would sit outside for hours with these intense concoctions on their hair to try and lighten their hair. And they even invented special hats to do that, which was also seen as a moment of extreme vulnerability, because a woman who had her hair out like that, who often had access to getting her hair dyed in the first place, was more likely to be married, and as such, being able to see her hair would be a big no-no. So there would have to be a very secluded special place where a woman could do this and still get the sun that they needed to lighten their hair and get the golden style or tint. And so the other interesting component is that depending on one's maintenance of one's hair, that can indicate a lot especially in ancient times and even pre our modern understandings of psychology today. There was a lot of belief surrounding hair and its communication of one's mental health. In the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, all the way to Victorian era England, there was a sincere belief that one's mental state could be fixed or changed if one cut your hair. So if somebody wasn't well mentally, that if you cut that person's hair, you would literally cut out the things that were unwell about them, because there was a belief that whatever was they termed it excess in their brain that was leading them to act in a way that wasn't seen as proprietary at the time, then you could just remove that issue from them by cutting their hair off. So if your hair was seen as scraggly, longer, disheveled, you were more likely to be seen as a witch. And you see this trope consistently in media. A lot of witches in media have a very like wild big hair that is untamable and often quite frizzy and quite long. And they're often also portrayed as adult women who don't have their hair pulled back in the way that a married woman would, of the age range that many people assumed you were supposed to be married, which could then indicate other negative things about a woman who was not married and also still willing to have her hair out and in the open. There's a lot of contrasting stylistic expectations around what hair was supposed to be at different periods of time. If you were in the Elizabethan times, it actually was seen as super the utmost signifier of class to have the frizziest hair imaginable. If your hair was very frizzy and very poofy and purposely piled on your head, then that was a signifier of wealth. Queen Elizabeth, Henry Tudor's eighth daughter, the heir that managed to rule England and had a very notable history in her involvement with international affairs and also the colonization of the United States, she had a very specific hairstyle that actually ended up influencing hairstyles across Europe and maybe even led to some of the extravagant hairstyles of Rococo France and Marie Antoinette. And that was the concept of taking one's hair and very purposely coiling it and frizzing it to be huge and quite high on one's head to give an appearance of height and strength. Also, one's access to a hairstylist and somebody who could help you was such a signifier of wealth. So because most of these hairstyles were very difficult to achieve without having somebody who was trained in the art of setting hair and styling it or cutting it, or a hairstylist to help you. Another thing that I thought was very interesting is actually Queen Elizabeth may have been influenced in this hairstyle and this design of having an ornate, very high and intense style of hair from a group who would wash their hair with limestone, because what it would do is it would actually dry their hair out and make it chalky. It would seem as if their hair was much lighter than it was and very poofy. It would make their hair huge. It would stand up. Both men and women would do this. And when men would do this, their hair would especially if their hair was shorter, it would literally they could run their hands through their hair and it would stand straight up. They would look like Billy Idol. I wonder if that's perhaps as well where we got some of our ideas in terms of alternative culture around hair. Because there are some things that when we look back in history, we can absolutely see a repetition of the styles and even these stereotypes in alternative cultures where I think people may be trying to take back the power of the way those stereotypes were used in a negative way to dehumanize certain groups of people. Hair is significantly more political than many people recognize, and especially when it comes to legal protection, a lot of people disregard the importance of hair and its significance on a cultural level, on a political level, on an identity level. It's very frustrating. Also, this concept of policing women's hair is something that consistently has been done to reinforce patriarchal standards across the world. There's a lot of beauty and power in how hairstyles have developed regardless of those policing practices. But unfortunately, it is one of those situations where, due to these ideas surrounding gender roles, there are some very frustrating assumptions about what is seen as acceptable and what is seen as not acceptable. So we talked about a little bit about long hair and its association with innocence. We talked about very tightly controlled hair, and just barely touched on the topic of braiding. And we did also talk about the concept of disheveled hair, which was associated with witchcraft and more looser morals in terms of a person, it helps communicate a great deal to the viewer about who that character is supposed to be and what they're supposed to represent. There's certain things that I had to adjust from my own expectations when I was looking into this, because I had certain assumptions about how certain hairstyles worked. And also I had certain assumptions about hair colors that I thought hair dye was not super accessible outside of henna. And I also had this assumption that even with trade routes, it probably still wasn't super accessible. I was assuming that it was very regulated by religious doctrine at the time. And I was quite surprised to be quite wrong. It turns out that it was also quite common for women to use their hair and the color of their hair as resistance against patriarchal norms. I will connect with you all again on Wednesday for my next stream, and I will let you know as soon as my next video is